Here's a headline you might remember. In March 2019, the FBI announced the completion of Operation Varsity Blues, a nationwide scam in which wealthy parents paid outrageous bribes to get their children into prestigious colleges like Yale and Stanford. 50 people were charged in the scandal, including parents, test administrators for the ACT and the SAT, college coaches who collaborated in getting underqualified students admitted to big-name schools. In addition to the bribes, the folks involved in this scandal falsified test scores on the ACT and SAT exams, made up fake awards and honors on the students' college applications, paid professionals to take tests or attend classes for the students, and put the students on college athletic teams for which the students had no actual athletic experience. Some parents even photoshopped their kids' faces over the bodies of professional athletes to make it look like their kids had real athletic experience. Comedian Trevor Noah from The Daily Show had one of the best jokes about the scandal. He said, some of these parents allegedly paid up to $6.5 million, which is insane. Honestly, for that amount of money, they could have just bought smarter kids. It's easy to make fun of people who seem to have many privileges. Did they earn them? Do they deserve them? Or are they just slackers with more money than brains? Because we obviously deserve all the blessings that we have in our lives, right? We work for them. We're good people, and that earns us some good karma, right? This former Texas Governor Ann Richards once remarked about President George Bush Sr. She said, he was born on third base and thought he hit a triple. Yes, we really hold tight to this idea of being a self-made man or woman. We get angry if people suggest that we benefit from some unearned privilege, but we do. Hanging on to that thought, let me ask you another question. What do you think it would be like to be born blind? What would you miss out on? What would you need help with? How do you think other people would treat you? I want you to think about that as I read again the opening words from today's gospel lesson. As Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? There it is again, getting what we deserve. This issue of earning our privileges, of deserving our blessings, has been around for a long time. The underlying belief here is that all of life should be just and happy and under our control. So injustice and suffering must have a root cause. We must deserve it in some way, right? Because if the blind man didn't deserve his disability, then we don't deserve our ability. We don't deserve our blessings and comfort and safety and health and happiness if he didn't deserve his blindness. And if none of us deserves our lot in life, then none of us can boast or complain if our lot in life changes. Whether we win or lose, we don't deserve either state. Nancy Iceland, Associate Professor of Sociology of Religion at Emory University, writes, growing up with a disability, I could not accept the traditional interpretations of disability that I heard in prayers, in Sunday school, and in sermons. You are special in God's eyes, I often was told. That's why you were given this painful disability. Or, don't worry about your suffering now. In heaven you will be made whole. This confused me, she went on to say. My disability had taught me who I am and who God is. What would it mean to be without this knowledge? My family, she goes on, frequented faith healers with me in tow. I was never healed, and people asked me about my hidden sins, but they must have been so well hidden that even I misplaced them. The theology that I heard was inadequate to my experience. You see, friends, sometimes our ideas about what makes life worthwhile about what we deserve, about what constitutes a blessing from God, about our suffering. Sometimes our ideas stand in the way of our understanding God and living a life of meaning and purpose. It is interesting that when we read the Gospels, that usually when somebody comes to Jesus with a question, Jesus answers with another question, or with a parable, or with a challenge. In fact, one theologian counted and discovered that of the 183 questions Jesus was asked, he only answered 3 of them directly. So sit up and pay attention. This is one of the most important questions of human existence. And it's one of the few instances when Jesus answers a question directly. Why was this man blind? Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. So the man went and washed and went home seeing. In this passage, we notice that there are 2 acts of healing in these 4 verses. There is, of course, the physical healing, and what a great joy and blessing that this man received. Because of the graciousness of God, he received his sight. But even before this man received physical healing, before he received his sight, this man received spiritual healing. When he heard Jesus say, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. You see, Jesus' statement gave the man the assurance and a hope that his disability, his blindness, was not a curse from God. And this hope and his spiritual healing is evidenced by the fact that the blind man got up and went to the pool of Siloam to wash. Have you ever tried walking across your bedroom in the dark? Most of us are reluctant to do that. So you can imagine how far it felt for the man to walk in hope, in faith, to the pool of Siloam. We don't know for sure where the blind man was when Jesus healed him. But one commentary writer says a trip to Siloam and back from the nearest wall of the temple, for example, would be about 1,300 yards. That's over half a mile, a pretty long trek for a man who was blind. Would you walk blind even half that distance on the word of a stranger? But this man took the risk because of Jesus' healing words. A professor of management studying motivation and burnout says there's some pain that needs a solution and some pain that needs a story. For the blind man, Jesus gave the blind man both a solution, physical healing, and a story, spiritual healing. That is, he was not disabled by some sin that either his parents or he had committed. And I want us to focus on that fact today, because most of us know what it is to carry around certain pains in life for which there is no solution. Unanswered prayer, an undeserved burden, a pandemic spreading across the world. We beg God for a solution. What if God gives us a story instead? I think the first part of that story would be that God can use every part of your life for his glory. Many of us settle for a wimpy calling. We are content if we are just good people who go to church and help our neighbors occasionally. We are not a shining example of the love, the strength, the power, or the grace of the Almighty God. Part of the reason for that is because we hide our suffering and our questions and our pains from each other. We think that our weaknesses make us less of a witness for Christ, when in truth, it is walking in faith through our pain that causes others to see God's glory in our lives. I'd like to give you an example of a woman who discovered God in her weaknesses. Sheila Walsh is a best-selling author, Christian singer, and former co-host of the 700 Club. She struggled with depression for years, but tried to deny it. She spent her adult life in a very public ministry role. She couldn't dare let down her guard and admit how hopeless and sad and burnt out she was. One day, a guest on the 700 Club said, "Sheila, you ask us every day how we're all doing, but how are you doing?" This question broke through Sheila's carefully curated image. She began to cry uncontrollably, right there on the air. But by that evening, she had checked herself into a psychiatric hospital. She gave up her co-hosting job. She took a step back from her ministries, and she admitted that she did not know who she was anymore. Today, Sheila Walsh is back in ministry, speaking and writing and sharing her struggles with depression. Instead of being rejected or put to shame for her condition, she discovered thousands of women who struggled with the same issue and needed to know that they were not alone. God didn't miraculously heal her of her depression. Instead, God has used her depression to draw her into a deeper relationship of trust with Him and to increase her ministry to hurting people. As Walsh says, the good news will never be good news until you know that God knows all of your bad news. And dear friends, not only does God know all of your bad news, but God can also use all of your bad news. God is most glorified in the way we handle our suffering. Our blessings don't draw people to God. No one is in awe of a healthy, smart, wealthy person who achieves great things. We are in awe of those who overcome hard times, who choose joy in the face of sorrow, who choose love in the face of betrayal and hatred. So every blessing and every hardship, every strength and every disability, every joy and every sorrow in our lives is an opportunity for God to work out His plan through us. Does that mean that God plans everything that happens to us? Well, not exactly. There is suffering that comes from the sins of others, like abuse or neglect or divorce. There's suffering that comes from impersonal forces outside of our control, like the coronavirus or dividing cancer cells, drought, recession. God did not intend for us to endure this suffering, but He does intend to work through this suffering, to strengthen us, to make us better able to demonstrate His glory in all circumstances. People need to see the character and power of God and how you handle your suffering. The second part of our story is that you don't have to understand everything about God. Just what you do know about Him. When the formerly blind man is questioned by his neighbors about his healing, he says, "The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes." A few verses later, the Pharisees interrogate the man harshly, but this man turns his hard time into an opportunity to share the truth of Jesus. He still doesn't know who Jesus is or why Jesus healed him. He thinks Jesus might be a prophet. He did not let what he did not know prevent him from sharing what he did know. It doesn't stop him from speaking truth to power. I'm reminded of some wonderful lyrics to a song titled My Story by Big Daddy Weave. The song begins, "If I told you my story, you would hear hope that wouldn't let go. If I told you my story, you would hear love that never gave up. If I told you my story, you would hear life, but it wasn't mine. If I should speak, then let it be of the grace that is greater than all my sin, of when justice was served and where mercy wins, of the kindness of Jesus that draws me in. Oh, to tell you my story is to tell of him." You see, the formerly blind man's story is a story of hope and love and life and grace. It's the story of Jesus, of what Jesus did in him. And he refused to be silenced by the fear tactics of the Pharisees. The next time they interrogated him, they accused Jesus of being a sinner, and the formerly blind man said, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." The final part of our story, brothers and sisters, is that we never know who needs to hear God's story through us. There's a wonderful story on the Divine Opportunities blog by a man named Larry. You see, many years ago, Larry was driving down Highway 240 in Memphis when he saw a car pulled off to the side of the road. He felt strongly that God was leading him to stop and help, so he pulled up behind the car and saw a young woman standing by the side of the road, staring off into space. When he asked if she needed help, she began to cry uncontrollably. This young mother had just come from St. Jude Children's Hospital, where her 2-year-old son was undergoing treatments for leukemia. Her husband had walked out on the family not long after the child's diagnosis, and this flat tire on the side of Highway 240 in Memphis felt like the final straw. She felt lost and alone. Larry didn't have a solution for this woman, but he did have a story. He knew now why he had felt the urge to stop. You see, 8.5 years earlier, when Larry's little son was just 2 years old, Larry's wife died of leukemia. He knew what it was to be grief-stricken and confused. He knew what it was to be a single parent. He knew what it was to feel alone, helpless, and desperate. And he knew what it was to rely on God for his strength. And so Larry began sharing the story of how God worked through his grief and his anger and his loneliness. He shared how God had helped him to be a single parent to his little son. As Larry wrote on the blog, it was a God thing. I don't recall a lot of what I said. It's like it just came and went out, a lot like a gift of the Spirit. It's not necessarily something I thought about and said. It just flowed. And Larry sat with the woman while she cried. Then he changed her tire and prayed with her. And when Larry drove away that day, he understood in a new way how God had used his pain to bring comfort and strength to someone else in need. As that professor said, there's some pain that needs a solution, and some pain that needs a story. You may never get an answer to your why. So, dear friends, I challenge you to change the question to how can God use this? For we ask God for a reason, and God gives us a purpose. In this lifetime, you may never get a solution to your pain. You may never experience healing. You may never see how God is using it. But if you give your pain to God, you can have a new story. It will be the story of how God is glorified in our weakness, not in our strength. God is glorified in our perseverance more than in our power. God is glorified more by our attitudes than by our achievements. And God is using our pain to grow us into people who reflect his glory and draw others to him. We ask God for a solution, and he gives us a story instead. It's the story of Jesus. Someone needs to hear the story of God in your life. How will you share it? Not just the shiny, happy parts, for God is glorified in the tough parts too. The good news is that God can use your bad news to share the good news. My prayer for each one of you this week is that each of us, in these trying times, allow the glory of God to shine through our good news and our bad news. For Jesus Christ is the good news, the real news. And the good news of Jesus Christ is the only news that can give us peace that surpasses all our understanding. And it is in his name we pray.